Good afternoon. My name's Henrietta Tan. I'm the Engagement Manager at Standards Australia. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, which is on 1684 Part 2, Residential Timber Frame Construction, an essential publication, of course, in the building sector, and we'll be looking at the key changes in NCC 2022. Before we go much further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So following the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions via Slido. The Slido code today is 3757257. It's important to give you a disclaimer. The information we're giving today is general information for education purposes. So please note today's information is not formal advice. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Boris Iskra. Many of you will know Boris. He has an extensive understanding of the Australian forest and wood products sector, with over 35 years of direct involvement, with many of those years directly involved in the development of Australian standards. He is Forest and Wood Products Australia's representative on Standard Australia's technical timber committees, including TM10, Timber Structures and Framing, which is of course responsible for the development of the AS 1684 suite of timber standards. Boris holds a Bachelor of Engineering degree and a graduate diploma in Building, Fire Safety and Risk Engineering. So it's with great pleasure that I now introduce you to Boris. Boris, take it away.
Thank you, Henrietta, and welcome everybody. So what I would like to do during today's webinar is basically go through details about AS 1684, but at the beginning talk about how it fits into the National Construction Code in terms of it's a referenced document and it does fit into the various volumes of the NCC, and I'll take you through that. Also, I'll then talk about the changes and some of the clarifications that have been made to AS 1684 parts 2 and 3. Basically, they align, and so the changes made in one also are reflected in the other. Part 2 being the standard used in non-cyclonic areas, and part 3 being in cyclonic areas. So obviously there are differences in design, but some of the key changes and clarifications are similar in both standards. Also talk about, I suppose, the key differences that have occurred between the 2010 edition and the 2021. So as you can see, there's quite a time period between release of new editions. There were amendments in between, but in terms of full revisions and update, there's around 11 years between them. But then I'll also talk about what the next steps are for AS 1684. So AS 1684 is constantly being reviewed and undergoing amendments. So I'll take you through what some of those steps will be for 1684. So just a bit of background. Australian timber framing standards have been around for quite some time. So the first Australian standard back in 1946 was basically dimensions of structural timber. So post-World War II, big demand for building, for housing in particular. So the standard was developed to provide sizing and to enable houses to be designed and constructed. But as things change, and as we're mainly aware, or most of us will be aware, that constant changes in designs, be it loading code, design practices, timber framing systems in relation to 1684, connections and bracing systems, they've all evolved over time, and so has AS 1684. So I suppose just a quick statement that over the decades, timber products have demonstrated a lot of design flexibility, proven reliability, adaptability, and now sustainability is coming to the fore. in use of our building materials. So how does 1684 fit into the NCC? So the National Construction Code is made up of a series of documents. On the far left is Volume 1, which is for commercial type buildings and educational buildings. Volume 2 is for our domestic houses. Volume 3 I won't touch on. It's a plumbing code. And then housing provisions is also a new document that's been released, which provides acceptable construction practices. And the ones to the far right, beyond that vertical dashed line, just a combination. You can also get the NCC combined volumes 2 and the housing provisions as a PDF. And also there's consolidated fire performance requirements, which has some interest for me, but not in today's webinar. So in terms of a reference document, so AS 1684 is a primary reference document within the National Construction Code. So each of the 3 parts are referenced. Under Volume 1 also references AS 1684 under various provisions, and I'll just briefly take you through those in a moment. So even though Volume 1, as I mentioned, is a commercial or educational type code, we can build low-rise buildings using our 1684, provided the loadings are the same. So, if we're designing an apartment building, the floor loadings would be higher. So therefore, we could only do a ground floor, but all the wall framing and the roof framing, etc., could be done. So that's how the Volume 1 calls up 1684. Volume 2 is the key one, which is focused on domestic construction. So 1684 is a key reference document there. And then the housing provisions calls up 1684 as well, but there's a range of clauses in the National Construction Code that also provide some acceptable construction solutions in there. So that's how AS 1684, each of the parts 2, 3 and 4, fit in to the National Construction Code. So if you just quickly focus on Volume 1, so as I mentioned, commercial type buildings. So under the structural provisions, we can design low-level or low-rise buildings, considering the loads that are being applied within each of those structures. So we can build anywhere from an apartment building to a hospital building, but they'll be low-rise, so 1 story, potentially 2. Under Volume 1, specifically under Part B1, which talks about structural provisions, the AS 1684 suite of standards provided there is deemed to satisfy documents. So we can use those documents in the design of these commercial style buildings. The NCC also has a structural provision in there, which talks about the use of software, and obviously 1684 itself doesn't have software at the moment, but there are software packages externally that can be used, and there's a software protocol that needs to be complied with that's put out by the Australian Building Codes Board. Basically, there are limits applied to the software under item 2 there, which I won't go into, but I suppose one of the key things is it's saying that these protocol requirements don't apply if the design software is basically used for designing of frame elements, such as in AS 1684. So that's basically under Volume 1. So as I say, there's referencing of 1684, but to a lesser degree, because the AS 1684 suite of documents is really focused on Volume 2 and the housing provision standard. So Volume 2 and housing provision standard basically focus at Class 1 buildings, so our detached or our row housing, also small boarding houses, where the number of people in there are less than 12, but also basically 10A type buildings where private garages or sheds or that sort of structure. So we can use AS 1684. So just with the software, again, similar to the volume 1, so it talks about having to comply with the protocol, and as long as the software basically just replicates the span tables in AS 1684, you don't have to comply with the protocols as long as you're within the bounds of AS 1684. So there's a clause within the NCC that specifically says that. So anything that just basically replicates the span tables is okay to use. And again, with the housing provisions say the same thing. So I won't go into that. And the key thing, I suppose, out of this, the reason for bringing this up is that there is software out there from a span table perspective. There are proprietary products. This is a free software that can be downloaded through Wood Solutions. Basically, the engine in this software package was used to generate all the span tables in AS 1684. So this particular software package is a black box version within the bounds of the ABCB's software protocol. So you can use the software in compliance with the requirements of the National Construction Code. The key call-up under Volume 2 is under the H1D6 framing clause. And the key to, I suppose, the key requirements under the National Construction Code, or the key mandatory requirements, are the performance requirements. Everything else in the NCC is basically non-mandatory. So you need to comply with the performance requirements of the National Construction Code. And basically the NCC says if you use the 1684 suite of standards, that they are deemed to satisfy the performance requirements. And that's in effect how the standards get used. The AS 1684 suite of standards get used. So that's just a little bit of a discussion, just to try and give some background as to the use of 1684 and how it gets called up under our building code or National Construction Code. Just now moving into the specifics of AS 1684. So as Henrietta mentioned, I'll focus primarily on parts 2 and 3, but I'll touch base on the part 4, 1684 part 4 later in the presentation. The key focus will be on part 2, but it also then reflects part 3. So the AS 1684, just a bit of background, it's a simplified version of the AS 1684 part 2. AS 1684 hasn't been amended or updated since 2010 and it still remains current. And at the moment, there have been no changes to 1684, apart from there was an Amendment 1, I should say, but there's been no further changes to the standard. The AS 1684 Part 1, which basically provided the design criteria that was used to generate the span tables, that has been superseded, although it still sits there and remains there as, I suppose, as support for the span tables. One of the difficulties over the years is the span tables have, when they were originally developed, some of the I suppose, the basic knowledge has changed, or we've changed practices, but we've got long service life and performance out of our existing timber frame structures. So the span tables therefore have currency and there's no reason to change them, even though they're based on this design criteria document that's dated back in 1999. But because things have evolved, there's a new standard that's been developed, AS 1720 Part 3. When I say new, 2016, so it's not all that new, but it was an evolution of the 1999 edition. So it was basically updated in accordance with current design practices. So if a structural engineer is going to try and design a beam or something to be used in your timber frame house, they would then turn to AS 1720 Part 3, not the AS 1684 Part 1. So as I mentioned, the span tables basically have remained unchanged and therefore can be used, and they are still referenced. They are called up by AS 1684, series of documents, and therefore can be used. So basically, the background to A1684, it's a prescriptive standard. So basically tells you how to put buildings together and also gives you a pathway for design. It is based a lot on historical experience, and we've got a lot of performance data, and there has been some full-scale testing on various systems that are used in A1684. Now, I've said it covers around 90% of housing, plus or minus 5 to 10%. I know house designs have changed, but 1684 has tried to cater for that to enable us larger open plan buildings. It has predominantly been written around sawn timber due to the history of its development, but it does introduce engineered wood products via construction practices. And as things develop in use of engineered products, more and more of these products will get introduced into 1684. There are two key things that it addresses. That's the structural design of framing systems and elements, as well as the construction practices. So just basically in terms of the changes to both 1684 parts 2 and 3, as usual, there's usually some editorial revisions. There are some technical changes. Sometimes we pick up on some errors that need to be corrected and clarify the application or interpretation of the document. Section 5, there's been a bit of change done in relation to installation of flooring and decking. Also to try and address ambiguities that have been raised in the use of the document, and also inclusion of some construction practices that can make these floor systems a bit quieter and a little bit more robust. There has been some additional details in relation to fixing of roof tile battens. Previously, we had only details for 35mm thick battens. Now there are 45mm details. One of the key changes is in relation to capacities of our bracing systems. With the change in resource, and I'm thinking mainly such as our softwood or a radiator pine framing, there's more a lower density material that's being used, and therefore it has a lower ability or lower hold ability of connections. And so the details in 1684 and now have dropped the capacity of the connections to represent JD5 capacities as opposed to what they were previously JD4. So basically there's been a slight reduction in capacities. But you can, if you do know that you're using JD4 material and you want to get that confirmed by a supplier, but otherwise a conservative approach has been taken in utilising JD5 capacities. There's also been some new details put in to enable tie downs to masonry construction, and I'll take you through some of those details. Some slight relaxation in notching requirements for non-load bearing wall elements. So now just looking at the key changes, this change in relation to layout is being brought about through Standards Australia's drafting protocols. So previously terms and definitions were under Section 2 in the 2010 edition. Now they're in Section 1, and there's been a editing of the way those terms are placed under that section. And there's also been changes to the way the tables are now displayed more for vision impaired users, and it's in line with the National Construction Code reference document requirements. So in effect, the bracing section, Section 8, has been edited, as well as the tie-down section, and I'll take you through some of that detail as well. So basically, the results of making the document a bit more user-friendly is that the standards have now, the Part 2 version's gone from 280 pages now to 316. So that's just basically more about providing more user accessibility. Now, just looking at the contents haven't changed, but the reason for the slide is just to show these are the sections that I'll focus on. So I've just briefly spoken about some of the changes, but I'll just go through each of these sections and just take you through. So nothing's really changed on the scope in general. 2-storey houses, maximum width of 16 metres, external wall heights of 3 metres, and the overall building height 8.5. And the key reason for that 8.5 metre height is that we use AS 4055 wind loads for housing for the generation of the wind loads on our structures within AS 1684 for our bracing type elements and tie down requirements. So I talked about online accessibility. This is an example of the 2010 edition. So this particular detail was contained within a table. So you therefore had to search out that detail. Now, under the 2021 edition, each of those connections has its own table. So it's just purely for accessibility purposes. Now just going through some of the changes in terms and definitions. Definition in the 2010 edition for coupled roofs. There's been no major change, just a bit of clarification. So the clause has just been slightly edited, but the intent is the same. With the additional words of with a coupled roof, we've got our roof structure. We're triangulating our roof structure. And so basically the diagram, sorry, my lights have just gone off because I'm not moving terribly much. Let me just quickly go and hit the light button. Sorry about that. There we go. Hopefully you can all see me again. So sorry about that. So basically I'll just put in these the dashed lines to just show the triangulation that's being achieved through the introduction of the collar ties and the ceiling joists. So non-coupled roofs, again, was a very simple statement in the 2010 edition. In the 2021, basically same intent, but just making it clear that there is no triangulation in a non-coupled roof. So the example out of 1684, again, I'm just highlighting with the dashed lines. So our rafter is being supported on ridge beams, or supported by ridge beams and intermediate beams within that diagram. So again, just more of a clarification. Now moving on to section 5, flooring and decking. Basically, the clause is just trying to make clear that the installation or construction details are for our flooring that's being laid as a structural element. So as I mentioned, 1684 has gone through an evolution, and traditionally, well, in the past, we used to lay our strip floors as our working platform. Things then changed with health and safety requirements, and so we tend these days not to install our strip floors directly to our floor joists as a structural element. But we do have examples or houses that have been built that way, so the provisions remain where we can install our strip floors or our particle board or plywood elements directly to our floor joist elements. And so basically it's not for when we're applying our strip floors over some other structural subfloor element. And so it provides, if you're going to lay your strip floors or particle board over a concrete slab and you're using the batten systems, then you can use it in that regard where you're laying it as a structural element. So I've just taken a snapshot of that clause, but basically it's clarified that it applies to structural timber flooring products and doesn't apply in effect to overlay or engineered flooring products that are put over some other form of substrate. Looking at the application in relation to the flooring products. So when we're installing our strip floors, in the 2010 edition, we talked about leaving gaps, either a single gap of 10 mil wide or smaller gaps distributed over that floor. Now, the 2021 edition talks about a 12 millimetre wide gap that's cork filled, and I'll get onto some details later as to where you can find specific drawings in relation to that. But it does talk about, potentially looking at the gaps and how many you need. That you've got to also take an account of the environment in where that floor is going to be laid. And it's just a note. So just in relation to standards, notes aren't mandatory, they're informative. So it's just trying to give you some additional information that depending on where you're going to be laying your floor, you may need to consider some other things. Key changes in relation to fixing of flooring. Previously you had up to 85 mil wide boards and talked about the nailing requirements. If you're over that 85 mil, had some further requirements with face nailing. The 2021 edition has taken that even further, but it's now dropped the boards down. You've got options for 65 mil width board cover and the fixings of single nails or through the face or secret nails. Also having then between 65 mils and 85 mil fixing details, boards over 85 mil requirements as well within that standard. Also talks about providing some supplementary support, in this case some sort of glue type an adhesive to help with the fixing of the flooring and also to minimise squeaking effects. So again, the note will just give some additional information on that. So this section's been broadened a bit. And this was provided, or the feedback in this was provided by the Australian Timber Flooring Association and their membership based on experience. So the installing of plywood and particle board, nothing too different there, just talks about the use of, we can use adhesives and mechanically fixed, or when we're doing particle board as well, same sort of thing, where we can also apply a flooring or an overlay to that substrate, plywood or particle board, but just making the point, we want to make sure that our substrates are well fixed to our floor joists or battens prior to installing any overlay. Now, as a 1684 is not a complete guide for how to install all these various flooring type products, but there is a design guide that's put out there for information from Wood Solutions. So for those that have an interest in how to do things, this particular guide covers everything on how to install structural floors, overlay floors, and to concrete slab floors. So a lot of great information in that particular document. Now, just moving on from floors to decking boards, 2010 talked about decking boards up to 100 mil width. The 2021 edition takes that up to 140 millimetre widths, and it's also introduced some screw fixings. So the 2010 edition only had nails or twisted shank nails or plain shank nails, and the new standard also has a screw fix in there, which is now appears to be a very common fixing used with decking products. Now, the notching requirements. 2010 was a simple paragraph. The 2021 edition has broken that up to provide a little bit more clarity. So that paragraph in the 2010 edition is now just replicated under clause A under the 2021, so as a general provision. And then that's further broken down into internal non-load bearing walls. So we'll have, plumbers and fitters trying to put pipework through elements. So they're encouraged, obviously, to put them through non-load bearing walls. And there are specifics provided about hole sizes for top and bottom plates, as well as noggings within our wall frames. Also, hole requirements within the studs and spacing of those holes. So you don't want a continuous row of holes through your wall, so you provide no lateral stability to that wall. And also notching requirements. So it's quite a generous requirement there, but only every fourth stud at a minimum or a maximum. So you can't get any closer than every fourth stud. So there's been requests of the committee to address these types of penetrations and and openings in building elements. So it's tried to provide some clarity. Now, bracing requirements that I mentioned early on, that there's change in resource, particularly with our radiated pine plantation resource. So the 2010 edition was all based on JD4, the strength group of material. And it had that if you were using JD5 material, then you had to reduce the capacity of our bracing types, depending if they were sheet, plywood braces or hardboard braces. That's basically been flipped now, where the 2021 edition is all based on JD5 or J5 capacities for our bracing elements, and basically giving you the option going the other way, saying, okay, if you do know that you have a JD4 type frame, then you can increase the capacity of your brace. So as I say, it's been done more as a conservative approach. I don't know how you can visually see that on site to be able to distinguish between JD5 or JD4 material. So the decision is made to go down the JD5 part. So what does that mean? So under the 2021 edition, our typical plywood brace has our 3 kilonewton capacity per metre, whereas previously it was a 3.4 kilonewton per metre capacity. Basically, with that plywood brace, you can just use standard bottom fixings or nominal fixings to that bottom plate. But with these plywood brace systems, there has been a tendency for people wanting to brace or plywood sheathe both walls, and that can be done. And it basically directs you to method A under that 18H example. So basically, if you're going to put a double sheathed wall system, we're then introducing the vertical rods, the M12 rods there at each end of that brace wall section. And the capacity, the JD5 capacities are provided. And previously, the JD4 capacities were obviously higher. So typically our brace systems are the traditional ones. But there are alternate systems that are being used in the marketplace. Orientated strand board sheathing products are used, basically are used as a performance solution. So somebody needs to provide the information for it to be used with our frame systems, and they can be done that way. But that information will be provided by the manufacturer or suppliers of the OSB product, and the capacities that they can be used with AS1684. But somebody needs to provide the information in relation to the OSB product, and that will be introduced over time into the standard. There are other systems that are also being used, and these days with people wanting large windows to backyards to see the swimming pool, etc. Sometimes you don't have enough walls to get the braces around those openings. So there are portal frames that can be used, and AS1684 does reference wall frames can be designed for portal action. And there are plywood systems, but that would be an engineered design solution. I suppose each of these are engineered designed. So that's a specific, the plywood is a specific design solution. There are proprietary LVL portal frame systems, and there are also truss type wall frame systems that can be designed. So we can have larger openings, these portal systems around the opening that can provide that lateral restraint to the end of that wall. So moving on to tie down. So basically what we're trying to do with tie down is not have any weak links. So we're trying to tie down our structure from top to bottom. So the diagram on the right-hand side, tying down every element from our roofing material right down to our subfloor or our slab. So we're trying to make sure that we have the capacities, and the changes in the 2021 edition There's a few new details that have been introduced. And this is one I think that I grappled with for a long while. Previously, we didn't have this side strap, which is a very simple detail for tying down our upper walls past our first floor system down to our ground floor walls. So a very simple vertical strap with nails at each end. Basically, the number of nails will determine the capacity of that system. But the strap capacity basically limits can limit the system. So it has a 6.5 kilonewton tensile capacity of that strap. So our nails or the number of nails will cut out at a 6.5 maximum capacity. There are also a lot of questions that were asked about tying down our structures to masonry. So there's a simple detail of tying down wall plates down to walls, to masonry walls, using a strap detail. So this is, I suppose, is always the difficulty as to how much detail is shown in a standard. Here we're focusing on the capacity of the timber. And if you're wanting to know the capacity of the unreinforced or the reinforced masonry, you've got to go to the AS 4773 Part 1 standard. I've had a quick look at that standard, and there are capacities using the similar approach that we use in 1684 in terms of the uplift load width detail and the tie down capacity. So you can basically equate the strap detail as shown on your screen and the capacity of the masonry, unreinforced or reinforced masonry systems. And the same sort of detail, in this case tying down trusses or rafters down to walls, including masonry. So even though I've referred to the masonry standard for the end of the strap, but that strap could be tied down to a timber frame as well, using the details. As long as it's got a looped strap detail, the capacities would be as per the table in the standard. And then the other, I suppose, detail is just tying down another way to tie down our roof elements, also tying down to our battens, so pulling that whole system down. And again, same sort of detail. We'll have types of nails at the end of that strap, and then you'll then need to look up, if you're tying down into masonry, what the capacity is within the masonry standard. So, sorry, just trying to get my slide. There we go. So what are the next stages with 1684? So each of the three parts has been reviewed, and there's been some revisions made. Again, sometimes just to provide some clarity or providing some additional details. The only difference there is that A1684 Part 4 has undergone a fairly major revision, and the key thing is that it's been revised to align with AS1684 Part 2, the 2021 edition. So as I mentioned earlier, the Part 4 is the 2010 edition, so it's got to pick up a number of the changes that were made to the 2022 edition of Part 2. But typically that's in relation to bracing and tie down, and that reflection of going from a JD4 down to a JD5 joint group. So we've actually had a committee meeting today, so this comment's slightly out. I was expecting the drafts would be available at the end of this calendar year. They'll now be available at the beginning of next year. There's still a bit more editorial work to do, and it's predominantly in relation to Part 4 because there were quite a few changes there. Parts 2 and Parts 3 I'll call them relatively minor changes, but the Part 4 is going through a bit of an update there. So the particular changes to Parts 2 and Parts 3, it was quite an interesting change. Having been involved in 1684 for decades now, you become a bit blasé with the materials that you're using in the standard. So we would always refer to, F5 radiata pine or now MGP 10s and 12s, but we never really refer to the types of grading standards for those products. So now there'll be inclusion of normative references within the standard to specifically define how these products are to be graded or manufactured. There'll also be some clarification around the use of the word we've agreed to during today's meeting as well. We'll refer to it as joist trimmers, solid blocking and noggings, that they don't need to be stress graded. Unfortunately, we had a lot of discussions with building certifiers and surveyors requesting that 1684 wasn't clear in relation to these elements, whether or not they needed to be stress graded or not. And unfortunately, sometimes there were requests being made of people to stress grade noggings, which wasn't the intent. So that will be now made clear in the amendment. Also, a key thing was where we've got diagonal braces, there are some details with cross bracing elements, metal cross braces, where we use loop straps around the plates down to the studs, top and bottom. Questions were raised about termination of the diagonal braces. Do they need to stop to the, let's say, to the left side of the strap or to the right side? Now just being clarified that it can terminate either side of those metal loop straps. And also there's some details about the minimum lengths required on those straps, and they'll be defined in the table as to what the length of those straps are and the number of nails at each of those ends. 1684, as I mentioned, is a fairly major update to align with AS 1684 Part 2, which is the parent document. So the new changes that are described for Parts 2 and 3, or particularly Part 2, will be included in AS 1684 Part 4. There will also be some additional terms and definitions that are introduced in alignment with Part 2. And the major changes, as I mentioned, are brace capacities and also tie-down capacities, but there'll be no changes to the member span tables that are contained within AS 1684 Part 4. So as a sort of wrap up, so basically what I've tried to do today is to just take you through how AS 1684 fits in with the NCC, how the various parts fit in. Also, just briefly describe the changes and clarifications that have been made, in particular to AS 1684 Part 2, which are then reflected in Part 3. The differences between the 2010 edition and the 2021 editions. And also just briefly about the upcoming public comment drafts that will go out. So I encourage you to log into the Standards Australia website, or if you're already registered for their newsletter, you'll be informed when it's out for public comment. I suppose the public comments are very important to the committee, but just to clarify, the public comments will just be on the changes that are proposed. So it's not, we're not expecting comments on every clause throughout the standard. That's not the intent. So the public comment drafts will be specific to the changes that I was referring to during today's presentation. If you have any other comments that you'd like the committee to consider, you can put them forward and they'll then be put aside for a next revision. But as I've said, the public comment drafts are purely, the comments that are being sought are purely on the proposed changes. Now, before we take questions, I just want to make mention of a Wood Solutions webinar. It's not to do with 1684, but it's a timber webinar on the 5th of December at 4:30 p.m. It's basically a webinar that's going to review the Hasseltrade building. This is a full mass timber building that's even with the connections being made out of timber, so basically a steel-free building, and will be presented by the architect and founder of the design company. So I just encourage you all to, if you're not part of Wood Solutions, register, and it'll be a very interesting webinar. So look, I'll leave it there. Thanks for the opportunity to just present to you today, but more than happy to take some questions. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Henrietta.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Boris. Goodness me, a detailed and highly informative session. Now, we do have some questions, which we love. So thank you to those who've been popping your questions on Slido. We've got a few minutes to answer them, so we'll start. We'll start with this one. Where does the 16-meter width restriction come from, and is there other plans to widen this given modern homes are getting larger?
Yeah, look, the 16-metre width comes basically tied in with AS 4055, the wind loads and housing. So there's within that document, it also provides the same limitations of AS 1684. So that's basically the reference standard that's used. If you want to go beyond that, you can use a structural engineer. Structural engineer would then have to go to the wind loading code, AS 1170 Part 2, and do the design from scratch. But there was discussion during today's committee meeting about, is there an ability to look at broadening or widening our buildings, but also the vertical height. The 8.5 is an overall building height requirement. So there was discussion about how that could be done. So it is on the agenda to look at, not for this next revision or amendments that's coming out for Part 2 in particular. But that is on the committee's agenda to look at.
Lovely, thank you, Boris. Boris, I believe new versions of both 1684 Parts 2 and 4 are due to be released soon. When will this occur?
Yeah, look, in terms of final, because it is an NCC, or both are NCC reference document, there is a real pressure on the committee to finalise the public comment drafts and get them out. As I mentioned, they'll be early in the new year. And then the committee, there's a period, I think it's an 8-week period for public comment. And then the committee will have to meet shortly afterwards to review those comments and accept or otherwise the comments. Everything needs to be completed, and I think it needs to be to the final stage prior to the 1st of May. So that's basically when everything needs to be finalised.
Thank you so much, Boris. Question from Peter. I found there is no current published data on the structural grade of strip flooring/decking. Most is graded on a visual grade and not a structural grade. Do you have a source for this information?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. The grades, I suppose that there is an assumption made on the grades. I did a bit of design work many years ago, and I'm now struggling to remember the specifics. But typically, the grades on our decking type products, I'm thinking hardwood are typically clear. So we assume that it's at our upper level of our stress grades. So at a minimum, our hardwoods, or when I say our hardwoods, it could be silvertop ash or it could be spotted gum, even with our Merbau or Merbau, you assume as a minimum it'd be an F17 equivalent, F22 more likely. And our softwoods are slightly different because they can have, different types of grades, anywhere from, sort of knotty decking through to clear decks. So, you're trying to do a bit of a relationship between grade and strength. There was some source, when you say source data, there was a design approach that was published by CSIRO. I'm going to get the years wrong, but it'll be back in the 70s, I think, or 80s, where they actually went through a design approach with that. And it was basically that sort of approach. You have to visually grade the product. You've got to make an assessment as to I'll use the word, the visual characteristics and the impacts on the grade. But if we're looking at radiata pine, I'll go back to my sort of F grade style, anywhere from the old F5 was a minimum up to an F11 type grade for our clear type products. Would be something of the way that you would do that. But like I say, there's no specific source. There's some basic assumptions that are put into the span table in 1684.
Thanks, Boris. I feel like we're putting you under the microscope here, so we'll keep going for a few more minutes.
Well, I'm here amongst friends. Happy.
Quite right. All right. In relation to the use of polyurethane or adhesive with structural strip floors, has consideration been given to the importance of disassembling and recovering the timber for reuse as we move towards a circular economy in an increasingly resource-constrained world?
Wow, that's a nice question. Look, I suppose with the adhesive use, I mean, they can be fairly rigid with the polyurethane, so it's got a fairly good grip. Look, I wouldn't say that it's been a top of mind consideration in terms of disassembly, but I can, if that's a focus, then you need to look at. I was just going to say, having a discussion with the Timber Flooring Association, who do a lot of this type of work, because I don't know, from a structural perspective, I don't know that you need that the polyurethane per se. We're designing the flooring to span between our floor joists or our battens. If you're going over the top of a substrate, be it plywood or particle board, obviously there's a lot bigger issue when we're going to be spreading or putting a zigzaggy polyurethane adhesive along the strip flooring. So, I mean, you're right. I mean, the question's right. If that's a concern, then you need to consider the use of that type of product, and it may just mean a difference in the fixing technique. You can close the centers on your floor, on your fasteners, to try and minimise the distance between the fixings, to try and make the flooring a bit more rigid. You can reduce the spacings. There may be other ways of doing it, but that's just a sort of top of mind response. But look, I'd say, not that sort of use of polyurethane adhesive from a constrained world perspective hasn't been sort of really considered. There you go, my lights again. I'll just move around a bit.
Thanks, Boris. Lovely quick question for you. Any plans to modify 1684 to go to 3 stories rather than 2?
Oh, look, as an industry representative, I suppose I shouldn't say representative, I'm just an industry person. Those discussions have long been held. 3-story stud frames were actually produced by the timber industry probably 15 or so years ago, but didn't have a real big market uptake. So it can be done. The difficulty is, once you start to talk about design of 3-story elements, then you go from having a 2-story building with a single floor to a 3-story building with double floors and the loading down onto that ground floor level. Like, you've got to then say, okay, what's my upper floor? What's my first floor load width? What's my 2nd story floor load width? And do various combinations of that. So, it might sound easy, but there's a bit of thought that has to go through that as well. We did for common stud work that was done. I can't remember if it was studs the size of openings. I'm sort of stretching my memory, or the jam studs, but definitely it could be done. It may be. I'm just trying to think of the Timber Solutions software. I think it has the ability to do 3-story in there. I know it has for bracing. I can't recall if it does for wall framing elements. But once you go beyond the 2-story level with the Timber Solutions software, it's not a software compliant to the ABCB protocol. So it's in there for information. So using the Wood Solutions or the Timber Solutions software is only compliant up to 2 stories.
Lovely, thanks, Boris. A question I can answer. So, is this presentation recorded, and is it something we can access after the event? Yes, the recording will be sent to you a few days after this afternoon's event, so we can access this recording. All right, a question from Ken the Builder. Thanks, Ken. Any change to double diagonal strap bracing and wall heights?
Nothing specifically with the double diagonal strap bracing. I think, if you're thinking about capacities, the only sort of change is going from the JD4 to JD5. The wall heights, you can do the capacities of the braces can be adjusted for wall heights. In 1684, they are the capacities there are based on a 2.7 wall height. If you go to 3, then you need to do a ratio of that of 2.7 divided by 3 times the capacity, and you can go up to 3.6. We do have actually wall studs that go to 3.6. I know I mentioned you've got maximum 3 metre wall heights, but you can go to 3.6 as long as your overall building height doesn't exceed your 8.5. But you need to take account of the brace capacity, overturning, tie down. So there's a whole range of other things that you need to be really focused on if you do go higher than our 3 metre that we use as our general design criteria.
Thanks, Boris. Question from Kenton. Thank you, Boris, for your presentation. Does a 30 by 8 strap on a double diagonal brace need to continue under the bottom plate? If so, where can I find that clause in 1684 Part 2?
Yeah, the straps, I mean, there is, I'm just now struggling because I've got one detail in my head where the strap does go over the top and we fix on the strap down, but that might be for the higher capacity ones. I suppose the question's similar to with our straps, although, sorry, our straps with our timber diagonals, our traditional ones, stop at the top plate. Our angled diagonals also stop at that top plate. With the straps, well, my response is I feel like we've got to take them over the top. But I know there's a detail in 1684. I just can't remember the specifics of that. If that's with loop straps, with the diagonals going over the top with loop straps, or what that was. So look, maybe we can take that on board as a question on notice, and maybe I can respond to that later, Henrietta.
That's lovely. Thanks, Boris. And I was going to say, unfortunately, time's got away from us. We do still have another question, but I think what we'll do is we'll provide an FAQ page post-event so that we can deal with any outstanding questions. Although we have had a final comment. Thanks, Boris, Standards Australia and Wood Solutions, a really excellent, informative webinar. So thank you. I would love to thank you so much, Boris, for giving your time and obviously for your ongoing commitment to standards. I think we've all learned a great deal this evening. I also, of course, want to thank everybody who's tuned in this afternoon for our event. We really enjoy these events and we hope that you find them beneficial. So thanking all of you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So thanks again, and enjoy your evening.